The ship's deck rolled beneath Elizabeth Mitchell's feet as she pressed herself against the mainmast, her wedding dress torn and salt-stained, watching Jerry Richardson's dark eyes search the horizon for the governor's warships. The pirate captain's jaw was set in grim determination, his weathered hands gripping the ship's wheel as cannon smoke drifted across the turbulent waters. She had made her choice 3 hours ago when Governor Samuel Alvarez demanded she marry his nephew Benjamin Phillips, or face exile to the colonies. Now, as the Crimson Revenge cut through the waves with British naval vessels in pursuit, Elizabeth wondered if choosing the pirate who looked like sin incarnate had been salvation or damnation. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck as Jerry's crew prepared for battle, their movements efficient and deadly. Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs as she remembered the governor's words echoing in the cathedral just hours before. The wedding that was supposed to seal her fate had become the moment she seized control of her own destiny. Jerry Richardson had appeared like a dark angel in the church doorway, his reputation preceding him like a storm front, and she had walked toward him instead of down the aisle to Benjamin Phillips. Now the consequences of that choice were bearing down on them with the full force of the Crown's Navy. Jerry's voice cut through the salt air as he barked orders to his men, his presence commanding even in the face of overwhelming odds. Elizabeth had heard the stories whispered in port towns about the notorious Captain Richardson, how he moved through the Caribbean like a phantom, taking what he pleased and answering to no authority but his own. She had never imagined she would find herself aboard his ship, much less as his willing passenger, in a desperate flight from everything she had ever known. The wind whipped her dark hair across her face as she watched Jerry navigate the treacherous waters with the skill of a man born to the sea. His crew moved around him with absolute trust, their loyalty earned through countless battles and shared dangers. Elizabeth realized she was witnessing something rare, a brotherhood forged in the crucible of life at sea, where every decision could mean the difference between freedom and the hangman's noose. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The story had begun 6 months earlier when Elizabeth's father died, leaving her at the mercy of Governor Alvarez's political machinations. Her family's shipping fortune made her a valuable pawn in the governor's plans to consolidate power in the Caribbean colonies. Benjamin Phillips, the governor's nephew, was a weak-chinned man with soft hands and cruel eyes who saw Elizabeth as nothing more than a prize to be claimed. The governor had made his intentions clear during their first meeting in his opulent mansion overlooking the harbor. Elizabeth remembered standing in the governor's study, surrounded by maps of the Caribbean and portraits of stern-faced British officials, as Samuel Alvarez outlined her future with the casual indifference of a man arranging cargo shipments. Her father's debts to the crown, he explained, could be forgiven in exchange for a strategic marriage that would unite two powerful colonial families. The alternative, he made clear with a cold smile, was financial ruin and exile to the harsh frontier settlements where proper ladies rarely survive their first winter. She had tried to maintain her composure during those early meetings, playing the role of the dutiful daughter while her mind raced for alternatives. Benjamin Phillips would visit her family's estate with increasing frequency, his presence filling the rooms with an oppressive sense of inevitability. He spoke of their future together with the assumption that her consent was merely a formality, describing how she would manage his household and bear his children as if she were livestock being evaluated for breeding. The wedding preparations had proceeded with mechanical efficiency despite Elizabeth's growing desperation. The governor's wife, Carol Gonzalez, supervised every detail with the ruthless precision of a general planning a military campaign. The dress, the flowers, the guest list, all were arranged to showcase the union of two prominent families, while Elizabeth felt increasingly like a prisoner awaiting execution. Her nights were filled with restless dreams of escape, though she could imagine no practical way to flee her circumstances. It was during one of these sleepless nights that she first heard the name Jerry Richardson spoken in hushed tones by the servants. The cook, an elderly woman named Christina Cruz, who had served the family for decades, spoke of the pirate captain with a mixture of fear and admiration. He commanded a ship called the Crimson Revenge and was said to be the most dangerous man in the Caribbean, a figure who appeared and disappeared like a ghost, always one step ahead of the naval patrols that hunted him relentlessly. The stories painted Richardson as a man of contradictions, Ruthless in battle, yet fair to his crew, a outlaw who followed his own code of honor in a world where such concepts were increasingly rare. Some said he had been a naval officer once, before something drove him to turn his back on king and country. Others claimed he was the son of a plantation owner who had chosen the sea over the suffocating respectability of colonial society. Whatever his origins, his reputation was that of a man who bowed to no authority and took what he wanted from a world that had tried to break him. Elizabeth found herself fascinated by these tales despite the danger they represented. Here was a man who had rejected the very system that now sought to control her fate, who had carved out his own existence beyond the reach of governors and their political schemes. The idea of such freedom seemed impossible, a fantasy as distant as the stars. Yet the knowledge that someone like Jerry Richardson existed gave her a strange comfort during the darkest moments of her engagement to Benjamin Phillips. The wedding day dawned gray and oppressive, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen. Elizabeth stood before her mirror as servants bustled around her, adjusting the elaborate white gown that felt more like a shroud than a celebration of new beginnings. Her reflection showed a pale young woman with intelligent dark eyes that held barely concealed desperation. The dress was beautiful, she had to admit, with intricate lacework and pearl buttons that had cost more than most colonial families saw in a year. But it represented everything she was losing rather than gaining. The cathedral bells were ringing when the first reports reached the governor's mansion that a pirate ship had been spotted approaching the harbor. Samuel Alvarez dismissed the news with irritated confidence, assuring his guests that the naval patrol would handle any threats before they could interfere with the ceremony. He had invested too much political capital in this marriage to allow anything to disrupt it, and his arrogance blinded him to the possibility that someone might dare to challenge his authority on such an important day. Elizabeth felt a strange stirring in her chest as the wedding procession made its way through the streets toward the cathedral. The townspeople lined the route, but their faces showed more curiosity than celebration, as if they sensed that something momentous was about to unfold. She rode in an ornate carriage beside the governor's wife, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling, while her mind churned with desperate thoughts of escape that seemed increasingly futile as they approached the church. The cathedral was packed with the colonial elite, men in their finest coats and women draped in silk and jewels, all gathered to witness what they believed would be a routine political marriage. Benjamin Phillips waited at the altar with a smug expression that made Elizabeth's stomach turn, his weak features made even less appealing by his obvious satisfaction at claiming his prize. The governor sat in the front pew like a spider in the center of his web, surveying his assembled guests with the satisfaction of a man whose plans were proceeding exactly as intended. The ceremony began with traditional solemnity, the priest's voice echoing through the vaulted space as he spoke of duty and obedience in marriage. Elizabeth moved through the ritual like a sleepwalker, her responses automatic while her spirit retreated to some protected place deep within her soul. She was dimly aware of Benjamin Phillips beside her, his presence like a cold shadow that threatened to engulf her entirely. When the cathedral doors burst open with a crash that silenced the priest mid-sentence, Jerry Richardson stood in the doorway like a figure from a fever dream, his dark coat billowing behind him and his eyes scanning the assembled crowd with predatory intensity. He was tall and lean, with the weathered features of a man who had spent years battling wind and salt spray, and there was something in his bearing that spoke of barely contained violence. His reputation had preceded him, but seeing him in person, Elizabeth understood why grown men crossed themselves when his name was mentioned in taverns along the coast. The congregation erupted in gasps and whispered prayers as Jerry strode down the aisle, his boots echoing on the stone floor with each deliberate step. His crew flanked him, hard-faced men with cutlasses at their sides and pistols thrust through their belts, their presence transforming the sacred space into something dangerous and electric. The governor rose from his pew, his face flushed with outrage, but something in Jerry's dark eyes made him hesitate before speaking. Jerry Richardson's voice carried easily through the cathedral when he finally spoke, his words cutting through the shocked silence like a blade through silk. He addressed the assembly with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed, explaining that he had come to offer the bride an alternative to the marriage that had been arranged for her. His proposal was simple and shocking in equal measure. She could come with him willingly and find whatever fate awaited her on the open sea, or she could proceed with the ceremony and accept the life that others had chosen for her. Or the audacity of the offer sent shockwaves through the gathered crowd, but Elizabeth felt something awaken in her chest as she met Jerry's steady gaze. Here was the choice she had dreamed of during all those sleepless nights, presented to her by the most dangerous man in the Caribbean at the moment when she had least expected salvation. The risk was enormous, she knew, possibly fatal, but the alternative was a slow death of the spirit that would leave her as hollow as an empty shell washed up on some distant shore. Governor Alvarez found his voice at last, sputtering with rage as he demanded that the pirates be arrested immediately. His calls for the guards were met with nervous glances toward the cathedral doors, where more of Jerry's crew had appeared with weapons drawn and expressions that promised swift violence to anyone who interfered. The balance of power in the sacred space had shifted with Jerry's arrival, and everyone present could feel the change like electricity in the air before a storm. Benjamin Phillips stepped forward with foolish bravery, his hand moving toward the ceremonial sword at his side as he declared that no pirate would steal his bride from him. Jerry's response was swift and decisive, his own blade appearing in his hand with fluid grace as he advised the younger man to reconsider his course of action. The steel sang softly in the cathedral air, its edge catching the light from the stained glass windows, and Benjamin's courage evaporated like morning mist before the sun. Elizabeth realized that this moment would define the rest of her life, that everything she had been and everything she might become hung in the balance of her next words. The assembled crowd watched her with fascination and horror, waiting to see if the governor's pawn would accept her prescribed role or dare to seize control of her own destiny. She thought of her father, who had built his shipping empire through bold decisions and calculated risks, and wondered what he would counsel her to do in such impossible circumstances. The wedding dress suddenly felt like a costume she was wearing in someone else's play, beautiful but ultimately meaningless. As Elizabeth stepped away from Benjamin Phillips and the altar that represented everything she was expected to accept without question, her voice was steady when she spoke, carrying clearly through the cathedral as she thanked Captain Richardson for his offer and accepted it without reservation. The gasps from the congregation were audible, but she felt lighter with each word, as if chains she had not realized she was wearing were falling away one by one. Jerry extended his hand to her with courtly grace, his dark eyes holding something that might have been approval as she placed her fingers in his palm. His skin was warm and calloused from years of handling rope and steel, a stark contrast to Benjamin Phillips's soft grip, and she felt a jolt of electricity at the contact that had nothing to do with fear. Together they turned toward the cathedral doors, leaving behind the shocked assembly and the life that had been planned for her since birth. The escape from the cathedral became a running battle through the narrow streets of the colonial town as Governor Alvarez's guards finally mobilized to pursue them. Jerry's crew moved with the precision of men who had fought together through countless dangerous situations, covering their retreat while Elizabeth lifted her elaborate skirts to keep pace with their urgent flight toward the harbor. The wedding dress that had seemed so beautiful that morning now felt like a burden, its layers of silk and lace catching on door frames and cartwheels as they navigated the maze of colonial architecture. Jerry stayed close beside her during the chaotic retreat, his presence both protective and commanding as he guided her through streets she had known since childhood, but which now seemed transformed into an alien landscape. His crew called him captain with genuine respect, their voices carrying no trace of the servile fear she had grown accustomed to hearing when men addressed Governor Alvarez. These were men who followed Jerry Richardson by choice rather than compulsion, and that distinction made all the difference in how they moved and fought together. The harbor came into view as musket shots echoed behind them, the governor's guards finally finding the courage to engage despite the obvious skill and determination of the pirate crew. The Crimson Revenge waited at anchor like a predatory bird, her black hull gleaming in the afternoon sun and her sails already being prepared for immediate departure. Elizabeth had seen many ships in her father's business, but Jerry's vessel possessed a lean elegance that spoke of speed and deadly purpose rather than mere commercial utility. Getting from the dock to the ship required crossing open water under the increasingly accurate fire of the pursuing guards, but Jerry's men had prepared for this contingency with their usual thoroughness. Small boats waited to ferry them across the harbor, while covering fire from the Crimson Revenge's guns kept the colonial forces at a respectful distance. Elizabeth found herself handed down into a longboat with the same efficiency that Jerry's crew applied to every aspect of their dangerous profession. The crossing seemed to take forever while also happening with dreamlike speed, the oars cutting through the harbor water, while musket balls whistled overhead and cannon smoke began to drift across the scene. Elizabeth gripped the sides of the boat and watched Jerry's profile as he coordinated the retreat, his commands carrying clearly over the sound of gunfire and his presence radiating the kind of calm confidence that came from years of facing impossible odds and emerging victorious. Climbing aboard the Crimson Revenge in her wedding dress proved to be an exercise in both physical coordination and symbolic transformation. The elaborate gown that had represented her prescribed role in colonial society becoming increasingly impractical as she adapted to life aboard a pirate ship. Jerry's crew treated her with respectful efficiency, helping her navigate the rigging and deck obstacles while maintaining the kind of professional focus that allowed no room for inappropriate behavior or crude commentary. The ship came alive around her as the crew prepared for immediate departure, their movements choreographed by years of practice into a deadly ballet of maritime expertise. Sails unfurled with practiced precision, while the anchor was hauled aboard with mechanical efficiency, and Elizabeth felt the deck begin to move beneath her feet as the Crimson Revenge caught the wind and started her escape from the harbor that had been Elizabeth's entire world until this moment. Governor Alvarez's response to the escape was swift and predictable, his outrage at being defied so publicly driving him to mobilize every available naval resource in pursuit of the pirate ship that had stolen his carefully laid plans. The colonial authorities had been hunting Jerry Richardson for years without success, but the humiliation of losing a prominent bride from her own wedding ceremony in front of the entire colonial elite demanded immediate and overwhelming retaliation. Within hours of the Crimson Revenge's departure, 3 naval vessels were cutting through the Caribbean waters in pursuit. Elizabeth stood at the ship's rail watching the coastline recede, her wedding dress, now practical, shortened and secured to prevent it from interfering with the ship's operations. While she tried to process the magnitude of what she had done, the life she had known since birth was disappearing behind them with each league they traveled, and ahead lay nothing but uncertainty and the vast expanse of the Caribbean Sea. The fear was real and immediate, but so was the exhilaration of finally taking control of her own destiny after months of helpless resignation. Jerry approached her at the rail with the quiet confidence that seemed to characterize everything he did, his presence both reassuring and slightly dangerous in the way of wild things that might be trusted but never fully tamed. He spoke to her with formal courtesy, explaining the immediate situation and the choices that lay ahead of them, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made even desperate circumstances seem manageable. The pursuing naval vessels were visible on the horizon, he told her, but the Crimson Revenge had advantages in speed and maneuverability that would serve them well in the coming chase. The conversation that followed revealed depths to Jerry Richardson that the stories told in colonial taverns had never captured, intelligence and education that spoke of a background far more complex than the simple pirate captain his enemies portrayed him to be. He asked about her father's shipping business with genuine interest, demonstrating a knowledge of Caribbean trade routes and maritime law that suggested formal training rather than mere practical experience. Elizabeth found herself responding to his questions with growing confidence, her natural intelligence finally finding an outlet after months of being treated as nothing more than an ornamental appendage to Benjamin Phillips. The ship's routine continued around them as they talked, Jerry's crew maintaining their professional focus while clearly keeping one ear tuned to their captain's conversation with the unexpected passenger who had transformed their simple raid into something far more complex and dangerous. Elizabeth noticed how they looked at Jerry, not with the cringing deference she had seen colonial servants show Governor Alvarez, but with the genuine respect that came from shared hardship and mutual trust. These men would follow their captain into hell itself, she realized, not because they feared him, but because they believed in him. The first real test of the Crimson Revenge's speed came as the sun began to set, painting the Caribbean sky in shades of orange and crimson that seemed to reflect the ship's name with prophetic accuracy. The naval vessels had gained ground during the afternoon, their larger crews and more powerful guns representing a serious threat despite Jerry's advantages in maneuverability. Elizabeth watched from the quarterdeck as Jerry made the tactical decisions that would determine whether they escaped or found themselves facing the hangman's noose before another dawn. The chase that followed tested every aspect of Jerry's seamanship and his crew's loyalty. The Crimson Revenge dancing through treacherous waters that would have claimed a less skillfully handled vessel while the pursuing warships maintained their relentless pressure. Elizabeth found herself caught up in the deadly game of maritime cat and mouse, her earlier life of colonial respectability seeming increasingly distant and irrelevant as she watched Jerry navigate challenges that would have destroyed lesser men. This was what freedom looked like, she realized. Dangerous and uncertain, but infinitely preferable to the gilded cage that had been prepared for her. The naval pursuit continued through the night, a deadly game of seamanship and navigation played out under stars that seemed unusually bright in the Caribbean darkness. Jerry remained on deck throughout the chase, his hands steady on the wheel while his crew made the constant adjustments that kept them ahead of their pursuers by margins that grew smaller with each passing hour. Elizabeth found herself unable to sleep despite the exhaustion that weighed on her limbs, the adrenaline of their escape, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead combining to keep her alert and watchful. The conversation between Elizabeth and Jerry resumed in the early morning hours. Their words carried on the salt breeze as the ship continued its desperate flight toward whatever sanctuary might be found in the vast expanse of the Caribbean Sea. She learned that Jerry had indeed been a naval officer once, his service record exemplary until a conflict with his superiors over the treatment of colonial civilians had led to his resignation and eventual turn to piracy. The decision had cost him everything he had worked for in his previous life, but it had also freed him from a system he could no longer serve with honor. Elizabeth shared her own story in return, describing the gradual erosion of her freedom following her father's death and the increasing pressure to accept a marriage that would have destroyed everything she valued about herself. Jerry listened with the kind of focused attention that suggested he understood the weight of impossible choices, his questions revealing an intelligence and sensitivity that the stories about him had never mentioned. She began to understand why his crew followed him with such loyalty, recognizing in him the rare combination of strength and honor that made true leadership possible. The dawn brought new challenges as the pursuing naval vessels adjusted their tactics, using their superior firepower to force the Crimson Revenge into increasingly dangerous waters, where hidden reefs and unpredictable currents threatened to accomplish what their guns could not. Jerry's knowledge of Caribbean navigation proved invaluable as he guided his ship through passages that would have been suicide for less experienced sailors. But Elizabeth could see the strain beginning to tell on both captain and crew as the chase entered its second day. The first real exchange of cannon fire came as they rounded a small island that Jerry had hoped would provide concealment, the naval gunners finding their range with deadly accuracy that sent splinters flying across the Crimson Revenge's deck. Elizabeth pressed herself against the mainmast as Jerry's crew returned fire with their own guns, the sound of battle filling the air with smoke and thunder, while the ship shuddered under the impact of enemy shot. This was warfare stripped of all romance and glory, she realized, nothing but noise and terror and the constant possibility of sudden death. Jerry's voice cut through the chaos of battle as he called for more sail, pushing his ship to speeds that tested every rope and timber while the naval vessels struggled to match their pace through the treacherous waters. Elizabeth watched him command his crew with the kind of calm authority that inspired confidence even in the face of overwhelming odds. His presence on the quarterdeck serving as an anchor point for men who might otherwise have been overwhelmed by the magnitude of the forces arrayed against them. The escape route Jerry had chosen led them through a narrow channel between two coral reefs, a passage so dangerous that the pursuing naval vessels hesitated to follow immediately. The gamble paid off as the Crimson Revenge threaded the needle with inches to spare while their enemies were forced to find a safer but longer route around the obstacle. Those precious minutes of breathing room allowed Jerry to gain the open sea ahead of his pursuers, but Elizabeth could see in his expression that the respite was only temporary. The second night of their flight brought a tropical storm that transformed the Caribbean from a sparkling paradise into a hellish landscape of towering waves and driving rain. The Crimson Revenge fought her way through seas that seemed determined to claim her, every timber groaning under the assault of wind and water, while Jerry's crew battled to keep their ship afloat and on course. Elizabeth found herself pressed into service alongside the regular crew, her hands raw from handling rope, and her wedding dress now completely ruined by salt spray and honest labor. The storm that threatened to destroy them also provided salvation. The violent weather forcing the pursuing naval vessels to seek shelter, while the Crimson Revenge pressed on through conditions that would have been suicide for less experienced sailors. Jerry remained at his post throughout the tempest, his voice carrying over the howling wind as he guided his ship through waves that towered above the mainmast and threatened to crush them with each rolling assault. Elizabeth watched him fight the storm with the same determination he had shown in battle, and she began to understand the source of his crew's unwavering loyalty. When dawn finally broke over calmer seas, the pursuing warships were nowhere to be seen, lost somewhere behind them in the vast expanse of the Caribbean. The Crimson Revenge had survived both the naval chase and the storm, her crew exhausted but triumphant as they assessed the damage and began the repairs that would keep them seaworthy. Elizabeth found herself part of that effort, her hands working alongside hardened pirates to patch sails and splice rigging while the tropical sun dried her salt-stained clothing. The days that followed their escape established a routine that gradually transformed Elizabeth from passenger to crew member, her natural intelligence and willingness to learn, earning the respect of men who had initially viewed her as nothing more than an unwelcome complication. Jerry proved to be a patient teacher, showing her the basics of navigation and seamanship, while never condescending to her or treating her as anything less than a capable adult. The partnership that developed between them grew stronger with each shared watch and each crisis overcome together. The relationship between Elizabeth and Jerry deepened through countless small moments and shared experiences that built trust more effectively than any grand gestures could have accomplished. She learned to read the subtle signs that indicated his mood and concerns, while he began to rely on her judgment in matters that went beyond simple seamanship. The physical attraction that had been present from their first meeting in the cathedral gradually evolved into something deeper and more complex, a connection based on mutual respect and shared values rather than mere desire. The crew of the Crimson Revenge accepted Elizabeth's presence with the pragmatic flexibility that characterized successful pirates, recognizing that she had chosen their dangerous life freely and was willing to accept both its risks and its responsibilities. Her background in her father's shipping business proved valuable as they planned their next moves, her knowledge of Caribbean trade routes and colonial politics providing insights that complemented Jerry's tactical expertise. She was no longer the governor's pawn or Benjamin Phillips's reluctant bride, but Elizabeth Mitchell, crew member of the most notorious pirate ship in the Caribbean. The transformation was not without its challenges and moments of doubt, particularly during the quiet hours of the middle watch when the full magnitude of what she had given up weighed heavily on her mind. The comfortable life she had known, the social position she had inherited, the security that came with following prescribed paths, all had been abandoned for an uncertain future that offered no guarantees beyond the promise of freedom. Yet each sunrise brought renewed conviction that she had made the right choice, that a life lived on her own terms was worth any price she might be asked to pay. The first real test of Elizabeth's commitment to her new life came when they encountered a merchant vessel flying British colors, the kind of ship that represented everything she had once been part of and had now turned her back on forever. Jerry's crew prepared for what appeared to be a routine raid, their movements efficient and professional as they readied weapons and boarding equipment. But Elizabeth found herself struggling with conflicting emotions as she watched the familiar rituals of colonial commerce from the other side of the divide. The merchant captain proved to be Jason Roberts, a man Elizabeth recognized from her father's business dealings, his face showing shock and disbelief when he saw her standing among Jerry Richardson's crew. The encounter forced her to confront the reality of her transformation in the most direct way possible. As someone from her former life witnessed what she had become and struggled to reconcile the elegant young lady he had known with the sun-darkened woman in practical clothing who now sailed with the Caribbean's most notorious pirate. Jerry handled the situation with characteristic diplomacy, taking what supplies his crew needed while treating the merchant vessel's crew with the kind of professional courtesy that had earned him a reputation for fairness even among his enemies. He made it clear that Elizabeth was under his protection and had joined his crew voluntarily, but he also gave her the opportunity to return to her former life if that was what she truly wanted. The choice was entirely hers, he said, and he would respect whatever decision she made without question or recrimination. The moment of decision arrived as Elizabeth stood on the deck of the merchant vessel, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of legitimate commerce, while Jason Roberts pleaded with her to abandon what he saw as a course of madness and self-destruction. He painted a picture of the life that still awaited her if she would only come to her senses. The possibility of marriage to someone other than Benjamin Phillips, the chance to rebuild her father's business empire, the security and respectability that came with following society's expectations rather than her own desires. Elizabeth's response surprised everyone present, including herself, as she thanked Jason Roberts for his concern, but declined his offer with firm conviction. She had found something aboard the Crimson Revenge that she had never experienced in her former life, she explained, the freedom to be herself without apology or compromise, and she would not trade that for all the security and respectability in the world. Her words carried across the water with quiet authority, marking the moment when her transformation from colonial lady to pirate crew member became complete and irreversible. The parting with Jason Roberts was cordial but final, both parties understanding that they now existed on opposite sides of a divide that could never be crossed again. Elizabeth watched the merchant vessel disappear over the horizon with a mixture of sadness and relief, knowing that she had closed the door on her former life forever, but also feeling liberated from the last vestiges of doubt about the path she had chosen. She was no longer running from something, she realized, but running toward a future that she would create for herself. Jerry's reaction to her decision was characteristically understated, a simple nod of acknowledgement that spoke volumes about his understanding of what the choice had cost her and what it meant for their future together. The crew of the Crimson Revenge accepted her renewed commitment with the same practical acceptance they showed toward all aspects of their dangerous profession. But Elizabeth sensed a subtle shift in how they regarded her, a recognition that she had passed some crucial test and earned her place among them through more than mere circumstance. The weeks that followed brought a series of adventures and challenges that tested every aspect of Elizabeth's adaptation to pirate life, from encounters with rival crews to narrow escapes from naval patrols that seemed to appear whenever they least expected them. She learned to fight with both sword and pistol under Jerry's patient instruction, her natural coordination and fierce determination making up for her lack of experience in the deadly arts that kept pirates alive in a hostile world. The calluses on her hands and the sun-darkened tone of her skin marked her transformation as clearly as any formal declaration could have done. The relationship between Elizabeth and Jerry evolved through shared dangers and quiet moments alike, their connection deepening into something that transcended the dramatic circumstances of their first meeting. She came to understand the loneliness that drove a man to choose the sea over land, while he recognized in her the same fierce independence that had led him to reject the constraints of civilized society. Their partnership was built on equality and mutual respect, rather than the traditional power dynamics that had characterized her engagement to Benjamin Phillips. The crew of the Crimson Revenge became the family Elizabeth had never known she wanted, their loyalty to each other creating bonds that were stronger than blood and more reliable than the social connections that had defined her former life. She learned their individual stories and struggles, understanding that each man aboard the ship had chosen this dangerous existence for reasons as complex and personal as her own. They were outcasts and rebels, but they were also men of honor who lived by a code that valued courage and loyalty above social position or material wealth. The final confrontation with Governor Alvarez came when they least expected it. As the Crimson Revenge put into a secluded cove for repairs and resupply, only to find themselves surrounded by a naval squadron that had been hunting them for months. The governor himself was aboard the flagship, his presence adding a personal dimension to what might otherwise have been a routine military engagement. Elizabeth realized that this moment had been inevitable from the instant she walked away from the altar, that some conflicts could only be resolved through direct confrontation between irreconcilable forces. The battle that followed tested every lesson Elizabeth had learned about seamanship and combat, the Crimson Revenge fighting against overwhelming odds, while Jerry's tactical brilliance and his crew's unwavering loyalty kept them in the fight despite the numerical disadvantage. Elizabeth found herself in the thick of the action, her sword in her hand and her heart hammering with the kind of fierce joy that came from finally being able to strike back at the forces that had tried to control her destiny. This was what freedom felt like, she realized. Dangerous and exhilarating, and absolutely worth fighting for. The turning point came when Elizabeth found herself face to face with Benjamin Phillips, who had accompanied his uncle on what was supposed to be a mission of recapture and redemption. The man who had expected to claim her as his bride now faced her as an enemy, his soft features twisted with rage and humiliation at seeing what she had become. Their brief duel was more symbolic than tactical, representing the final severing of all ties to the life that had been planned for her by others who thought they knew what was best for a woman of her station. Jerry's voice carried across the battle as he called for a fighting retreat, his tactical assessment of the situation indicating that continued engagement would result in unnecessary casualties among his crew. The Crimson Revenge had proven her point, demonstrating that she could not be taken easily despite the governor's superior numbers. But discretion remained the better part of valor when facing such overwhelming force. Elizabeth followed his lead without question, her trust in his judgment absolute after all they had experienced together. The escape from the governor's trap required all of Jerry's skill and experience. The Crimson Revenge, threading her way through coral reefs and hidden passages that only someone with intimate knowledge of Caribbean waters could have navigated successfully. Elizabeth worked alongside the crew with practiced efficiency, her movements now those of an experienced sailor, rather than a desperate refugee, as they fought their way clear of the naval squadron and into the open sea beyond. The victory was not in defeating their enemies, but in maintaining their freedom despite overwhelming odds. The aftermath of the battle brought a moment of quiet reflection as the crew assessed their situation and planned their next moves. The immediate danger passed, but the larger conflict far from resolved. Elizabeth stood at the ship's rail watching the sunset paint the Caribbean sky in shades of gold and crimson, her thoughts turning to the journey that had brought her from a colonial mansion to the deck of a pirate ship in the space of a few short months. The transformation felt both gradual and sudden, as if she had been becoming this person all her life without realizing it until the moment Jerry Richardson appeared in the cathedral doorway. Jerry joined her at the rail as the first stars appeared overhead, his presence as comfortable and familiar as an old friend despite the relatively short time they had known each other. Their conversation ranged over the events of the day and the possibilities that lay ahead. But underneath the practical concerns ran a deeper current of understanding and connection that needed no words to express itself. They had found in each other something that neither had expected to discover. A partnership that transcended the dramatic circumstances of their meeting to become something genuine and lasting. The crew of the Crimson Revenge settled into their evening routine around them, the sounds of shipboard life creating a familiar backdrop as Elizabeth reflected on how completely her world had changed. The woman who had stood in the cathedral wearing a wedding dress and facing a future she did not want seemed like a stranger now, someone she might have known once but could barely remember. In her place stood someone stronger and more complete, a person who had discovered capabilities and desires she had never known she possessed. The freedom Elizabeth had gained came with a price, she knew, the constant danger and uncertainty that characterized life beyond the reach of civilized authority. But it also brought rewards that no amount of security could match. She had found her true self in the most unlikely circumstances, surrounded by men who lived outside society's rules, but who honored their own code with absolute integrity. The love that had grown between her and Jerry was built on shared values and mutual respect, rather than social convenience or family pressure, making it stronger than anything she had ever imagined possible. The future stretched ahead of them, like the vast expanse of the Caribbean Sea, full of possibilities and dangers in equal measure, but theirs to navigate according to their own choices and desires. Elizabeth had learned that true freedom was not the absence of risk, but the ability to choose which risks were worth taking. And she had chosen a life that honored her own values rather than the expectations of others. The governor's pawn had become the pirate's partner, and in that transformation had discovered a strength and independence that no force on earth could take away from her. As the Crimson Revenge sailed on through the tropical night, her crew secure in their loyalty to each other and their captain, Elizabeth Mitchell knew that she had found her true home at last. The ship that had once seemed like a desperate escape had become the foundation of a new life built on courage and authenticity rather than compromise and resignation. She had chosen the pirate who looked like sin incarnate, and in doing so had discovered that sometimes salvation came in the most unexpected forms, carrying with it the promise of adventures yet to come and a love that would endure whatever storms the future might bring.